What is good, everyone? Welcome back to another video. When it comes to animated movies, critics don't tend to respect them as much as the audience does. I mean, look how long it took the Academy Awards to even recognize Best Animated Feature. So more often than not, you're gonna find animated movies that the general audience likes significantly more than critics do. But what about animated films that critics like significantly more than the audience does? Well, that's what I want to dive into today. Now, I used the word loved in the title because I wasn't sure exactly what word to use. And also, I did need a clickbait title. But when I use the word loved, I'm mainly looking at movies that were certified fresh on Rotten Tomatoes. So basically, everything on this list is probably going to have like a 74% or higher. That's just some context before getting into this. With that said, I want to start off with an honorable mention: the 2021 iteration of Diary of a Wimpy Kid. This movie has very few reviews on Rotten Tomatoes, but from what was there, critics generally liked the movie, while audiences definitely did not. Most Diary of a Wimpy Kid fans prefer the live-action movies, and the animated film mainly just came off as a completely unnecessary and lifeless iteration of the source material. I would have included it in the top 10 had there been more critic reviews backing up the score, but since they're not, I just wanted to include it as an honorable mention, and the fact that there's so few reviews probably indicates how forgettable this movie is. Oh, and one more thing. This list is not really in any kind of particular order, but I did my best to structure it according to what I think is the least to greatest divide, but I'm not holding very strongly to it. And I'm not going solely off of numbers. I'm also going to be trying to consider a little bit of just the general cultural conversation around it now. So, with that said, let's get into number 10. Number 10, Jimmy Neutron, Boy Genius. The Jimmy Neutron movie, as well as the TV series, are definitely not known for having high quality animation. And while that may be more forgivable in a TV show, it's typically going to be less forgived inside of a theatrical It's generally going to be less forgivable in a theatrically released film. Also, as with many TV shows that have a feature film, many audience members took issue with the plot and felt like it was too simplistic and served more of a TV narrative than a movie. And as I just said, this is a common critique that people will have for cartoons that go on to make a feature film. I'm pretty sure this movie came out before the TV series, but the idea is still the same. And speaking of cartoons that released a feature film, number 9, the Wild Thornberries movie. Now, I had not seen this movie, nor have I seen any of the cartoons, but it seems like for the people that did, they were not huge fans of this movie. The Wild Thornberries TV show debuted around the late era of Nickelodeon's golden age, and it doesn't seem to be one of their more remembered or acclaimed shows from that era, and perhaps some of that reflected in the movie. Similar with Jimmy Neutron, Boy Genius, the plot for the Wild Thornberries movie was considered to be kind of simplistic, but critics seem to appreciate the movie more for it having a more environmentalist message, but I don't think that the audience really took that into as much account as the critics did. So in the end, the critics gave the movie an 80% on Rotten Tomatoes, while the audience gave the film a 53%, and IMDb, which leans more toward the audience, has the movie scored at a 5.7 out of 10, which is a pretty bad score. There's not a lot else to say here. This is a common critique of just cartoons that get turned into feature films, and there's a whole host of cartoon movies that did not get great reviews from the audience because the plot was viewed as lacking and serving more of the cartoon style plot than a film. That is kind of interesting to me because I'd expect critics to have more of an issue with that, but apparently not, at least when it comes to Nickelodeon movies. Number 8, The Good Dinosaur. Now, this movie does have a fresh score from both critics and audiences on Rotten Tomatoes, as well as on Metacritic. However, the audience score is quite a bit lower than the critic score, being a full 12% lower, and it's only spiraled downward in the cultural conversation stints. Did I just say stints? Based on the Rotten Tomatoes critic score, The Good Dinosaur is not only a certified fresh film, but it has a higher score than Cars 1, which would be unheard of in the modern day. Perhaps some of it came from the general public riding off the high of Inside Out 1 and just kind of hoping that Pixar was back in form, so they were a little bit more forgiving of The Good Dinosaur, even though most would admit that it's quite beneath Pixar standards nowadays. But this movie is often considered by the general audience to be one of Pixar's worst movies now, many even having it below Cars 2, and definitely having it below Cars 1. Essentially, The Good Dinosaur is a generic adventure between a farm boy and his dog, except the farm boy is a whiny dinosaur, and the dog is a human child that can't talk. This movie is often praised for having incredible background visuals, while also being criticized for clashing awkwardly with the cartoony designs of the characters, though the biggest criticism is typically just having a very generic plot that just does not live up to the standards of Pixar movies. I do think most critics would agree that The Good Dinosaur is one of Pixar's weakest films, but I actually do think a lot of them, even in the modern day, would put it above the entire Cars trilogy. Which, hey, good on them for doing that to Cars 2, but for the rest, that's definitely something that I don't think the general audience would follow suit with. But critics don't tend to like the Cars movies as much as the general audience does. Number 7. Turning Red. Now, some of the divide here could probably be explained through Turning Red having a little bit more of a niche appeal compared to other Pixar movies, where just the hyperactive teenage girl interested in boy bands and going through puberty, that alone could just be some stuff that doesn't necessarily mean audiences will hate it, but a portion of the audience may not be as interested in that compared to the typical Pixar movie with more broad appeal. I think generally critics and audiences like Turning Red, but critics hail Turning Red as up there with some of the top Pixar movies with a literal 95% on Rotten Tomatoes, while the audience score is almost a full 30% lower. And even going into some of the IMDb user reviews, the 1 out of 10s and the 10 out of 10s are almost at a 50-50 split. So it's definitely a lot more polarizing for the audience compared to for critics. And some of that goes into deeper things, like not only did some people just find it annoying with all the hyperactivity, but some of the messaging of the movie rubbed a lot of people the wrong way, as many people thought that the movie was encouraging teens to kind of disobey their parents. And the movie does have a little bit more of a sexual edge compared to your average kids film, which was pretty off-putting for a good bit of the general public, especially probably parents. But again, there are a lot of audience members that do like the movie, but it certainly is not held in the same top tier acclaim that the critics have it. It's a lot more polarizing for the audience compared to critics who are more unanimously positive. Number 6. Orion and the Dark. This is the most recent movie on this list so far, having come out just last year. Now, I have seen this movie, and I did think it was good enough, but I absolutely do understand why this movie did not work for a large portion of the general audience. This movie has a major split between critics and audiences, where critics acclaimed Orion and the Dark, giving it a 92%, while the audience gave the movie a 59%. And it's really no secret what the big dividing point with this movie is. And that is pretty much around the halfway point of this film. It takes kind of a surrealist turn, and from that point, it either works for you or it doesn't. Let me try to simplify the plot. So there's this kid named Orion, and like many children, he's afraid of the dark. And one night, he's approached by a personification of dark, who takes him on an adventure to try helping him overcome his fears. Now, throughout the movie, it's revealed that the story's not actually taking place in real time, but in fact, it's being framed through an adult Orion telling the story to his daughter because she was afraid of the dark. And then, around the halfway point of the movie, Dark gets killed by the sunlight. And then, the story suddenly stops, and Orion tells his daughter that she has to fill in the rest of the story and decide what happens next. So then the movie just kind of completely changes points of view and a sense of grounded reality by shifting to the daughter's perspective and her making decisions on how to bring Dark back. And then, double twist, the movie's actually shown to be framed from Orion's daughter being an adult and telling the story to her son. And she does the same thing as Orion did to her by telling her son that he has to fill in the rest of the story and decide how the story will end. And by that point, many people will check out of the movie, finding it to be very messy and lacking any kind of firm cohesion and structure, thus explaining why the audience did not like this movie a whole lot. For me, it did work well enough because I took it as in keeping with the general theme and idea of the movie, as these parents are trying to use a bedtime story as kind of a way to help their children overcome their fears of the dark. And kind of the whole point of the bedtime story is to take the kids' mind off of their fears and instead try to use their creativity and their imaginations to conquer their fears of the dark. Thus, the bedtime story serves as less of a firmly structured story and as more of like a generational relic that's passed down to each kid in order to add their own piece to the story. Almost like a quilt that gets a new piece sewn on for each generation. So that's how I took it, and I imagine that's how a lot of critics took it. But I can completely understand how many people would find it unsatisfying and view it as copping out of the conflicts that it sets up by just having kids randomly imagine ways out of their obstacles. I could see how a large portion of the general audience could view that as completely destroying the tension of the story, and thus that kind of explains the divide between critics and audiences on this movie. Number 5, Strange World. Now, this is the only movie on this list that doesn't have a certified fresh on Rotten Tomatoes, but I had to include it because the audience score is so dramatically lower than the critic score that it's an anomaly. When looking at Rotten Tomatoes, Strange World does have a 72%, so not far off from a certified fresh score and still a fairly positive score. But don't be fooled by that audience score of 66%. Verified audience is an inaccurate ploy by Rotten Tomatoes to inflate the score for movies by significantly restricting the full sample of people who watch the movie to only people that show Rotten Tomatoes proof of their purchased ticket, as if the only way to watch a movie, especially a movie that bombed, is by buying a ticket in the theater. When adjusting for the entire audience on Rotten Tomatoes, the score actually comes out to not a 66%, but closer to a 38%, nearly cutting the critic score in half. And it's not just Rotten Tomatoes. IMDb has this movie at a 5.7, which is not good, and Metacritic audience has the movie at a 3.6. Of course, there's always possibility for review bombing, but as a general whole, it's clearly more accurate that the audience is negative on this movie as opposed to positive. And I think the divide here is a little bit more clear. I'll just start by reading the critic consensus on Rotten Tomatoes. Strange World is a Disney milestone in terms of representation, but as a storytelling experience, this dazzlingly animated adventure offers little audiences haven't seen already. In other words, the plot and story kinda suck, but gay and environmentalists, therefore good. And in more serious, expanded terms, much of the critics are admitting that they don't like the overall plot of the movie, but they do like the political leanings that Disney injects into this film, and thus they give it higher praise and appreciation on account of that. However, critics and the general audience don't often see eye to eye politically, and a large portion of the general audience doesn't like Disney's political leanings. And Disney knew that, which is why they didn't bother to market this movie. So what do you get when the critics admit the plot isn't good, but they like the politics, and much of the audience agrees that the plot isn't good, but they don't like the politics? Well, you get a major divide like this. And a historic box office bomb. Number 4, Sausage Party. Now let's take a brief moment of silence for the parents who brought their kids to this movie thinking that it was PG. Now, when it comes to adult animated movies, there's not that many that get theatrically released, and prior to 2016, Probably the most famous one was South Park's movie in 1999. But in 2016, Sausage Party became the first CGI animated R-rated film. And the story was primarily developed by famed raunchy comedian actor Seth Rogen. So unsurprisingly, what do you end up getting? You get a comedy that relies on as much excess shock value as possible to pass off as its humor. And the critics? They ate it up. The audience puked it out. As I said earlier, this movie is essentially a one-trick pony that just plays off of people's typical expectation of CGI animated movies being for children. And thus, the entire movie is just trying to be as graphic and intense as possible. So now you have animated characters getting brutally killed, saying the F word in every sentence, taking hard drugs, and a third act that could essentially amount to being food pornography. I mean, seriously, what person in their right mind would sit there and meticulously craft out an animated food orgy? I mean, stop and think about that. But don't think about it too hard. The graphic nature of the final sequence of this film was literally so bad that it was initially rated NC-17. And they had to edit sequences in the final act to secure an R rating. A movie about animated food needed to ward off an NC-17 rating. Seth Rogen, Pumbaa, are you good, my guy? But that's the entire gist of the movie. It just wants people to leave the theater saying, wow, an animated movie did insert graphic thing? And that's the entire basis of all the humor for about an hour and a half straight. And the score for IMDb is around like a 6.1, which is kind of mixed negative, and the user reviews on IMDb are overwhelmingly negative. Much of the audience just found the movie to be extremely dumb, nihilistic, and unfunny, with many people especially disliking the final sequence, finding it to be more gross than humorous. So while many critics appreciated it and considered it an abrasive, raunchy comedy, much of the audience pretty much viewed the film as what happens when a bunch of juvenile teens make a movie while they're high. Before I get to the top 3, be sure to like and subscribe if you're liking this video so far. Number 3, Ralph Breaks the Internet. Again, this is another movie that technically has positive scores from both the critics and the audience on Rotten Tomatoes as well as IMDb, but don't be fooled by that. The general reception between critics and audiences is vastly different. Not only did the critics give Ralph Breaks the Internet an 88%, but the general consensus among critics is that Ralph Breaks the Internet is better than Wreck-It Ralph 1. What? Which is something that most of the general public definitely does not agree with. Many people would consider Wreck-It Ralph 1 to be one of Disney's best movies ever, but critics did not like it as much as the audience did, and it does have a lower score than Wreck-It Ralph 2. But when it comes to the general audience, Wreck-It Ralph 2 is an immensely polarizing movie, and its reputation has only gotten worse and worse and worse with each passing year. The audience score for this movie is a full 20% lower than the critic score on Rotten Tomatoes, and while the IMDb score is fairly positive, a deeper dive into the user reviews will tell you that there's almost a 50-50 split between people that like the movie and people that hate the movie. Most people tend to vote within the 10-star and 1-star range. That's just kind of the critical climate that we live in. And it's nearly a 50-50 split based off the 10 out of 10s and 1 out of 10s. And most video essays about this movie that you'll find online are pretty negative on this film. While a lot of critics thought that the sequel did a better job of fleshing out Ralph and Vanellope's friendship, much of the audience viewed the overall movie as Disney's version of the Emoji Movie that betrayed a lot of the aspects set up in the first movie. Like, why is Ralph suddenly acting like such a dumb, creepy man-child in this movie? Or, why did we spend an entire first movie trying to get Vanellope set up in her own game, only for her to try running away from her game in the next movie? And isn't she going turbo by doing that? These were the kinds of questions that caused a lot of the audience to find this film to be a poor betrayal of the first movie. as well as having a ton of internet culture humor that's not known for aging well. So even though it might look on the surface like critics and audiences like the movie, the general audience perspective is significantly less positive, and probably negative at this point. Number 2, Early Man. Early Man was made by Aardman Studios, which is a studio that critics tend to seriously love a lot. Their movies tend to get the type of scores that Pixar movies get. And although critics agreed that Early Man wasn't as good as Aardman's typical work, they still did like the movie, while the audience didn't seem to care that much for it. The story basically centers around cavemen learning how to play soccer, or
football.
And then they must face off in a soccer match in order to take back their homeland from an evil emperor voiced by Loki.
I am willing to offer you a deal. A way out. That's good.
But similar to critics, the general audience found this movie to be beneath the standards of the general Aardman films, but they were more negative on it than critics were. Many found the story to be pretty predictable and formulaic, and they found the humor to be less clever than the typical Aardman humor style, which ended up making this one of Aardman's more forgotten films and a box office bomb. Number 1, Antz. From the moment of its release, this debut DreamWorks movie was immediately wrapped in controversy for being clearly similar to Pixar's A Bug's Life, which was released during the same year. This created a conflict in which people picked sides between being Team A Bug's Life or Team Antz. The critics wanted to play the everyone's a winner game by giving them the exact same score. The audience was not as interested in doing that, and ultimately they gave the movie a 52%. And while some of it had to do with the conflict with A Bug's Life, there was also negativity towards the fact that Antz simply was not really for kids. It marketed itself as a kid's film, but with numerous extreme adult jokes and a sprinkle of bad language, and some pretty intensely dark scenes of violence. Many people found Antz to just be tonally inconsistent and off-putting. It was clear that DreamWorks was struggling to find their footing in the animation world and establish a balance between appealing to adults and still being appropriate for kids. And thus, Antz suffered as a result. But 25 years later, I think DreamWorks has found their footing quite well. How many of these movies have you seen? Do you agree more with the critic side or the audience side? Maybe give some of them a watch and see where you land on them. Except Sausage Party. Do not watch Sausage Party. Please! But if you want more videos that relate to Rotten Tomatoes or critic scores, check out my ranking on the lowest rated movies on Rotten Tomatoes from each animation studio. Thank you for watching, and I'll catch you in the next video.